So welcome back, everybody. Again, my name's Tom Banchoff. I'm director of the Berkley Center here at Georgetown, and we're delighted to be co-conveners along with John Borelli and the President's Office of this symposium, which was put together, of course, by the Global Ethic Foundation and Bradley Shingleton. It's been a wonderful couple of days. We've covered so much ground, I think, not just in the formal presentations, but also the informal interaction. I like the long coffee breaks. This is something we can learn from. The lunch that's integrated, the dinners. And there's also been a nice logical progression in the way our time together in this forum, in the plenary, if you will, has been structured, moving from the global ethic in broader terms to questions of law yesterday, and then this morning, moving to questions of policy and, of course, politics. And I think what we'll see in this last panel, which is entitled Interreligious Dialogue as a Foreign Policy Instrument, a further evolution of our thinking this morning, which did look at policy and politics, but sort of at a macro level, at the level of the international system. A conversation that surfaced again, one of the themes, I think, of this symposium, the structure of the international system, the persistence of state power, and the problems that raises in thinking about ethics in domestic and foreign policy, and about a global ethic in particular, the practical obstacles that raises, but also the challenges that we can all try to think about working to overcome in the years ahead. So I've given you the title of this session. The focus is foreign policy. It's not exactly clear where that will take us. We do have four folks up here who will help to frame things, but I've asked my colleagues, David Little, John Borelli, and Professor Küng, to limit their interventions to 5 to 7 minutes. I'll also have some opening remarks, and then we'll just throw the floor open, and we'll be sure to end right at 2:30. So without further ado, let me pass it over to my colleague, David Little.
Thank you, Tom. Time is brief, so let me proceed. I want to pick up on the connection between the global ethic and human rights language, which was discussed at some length yesterday, and then use my suggestions as a basis for thinking ever so briefly about interreligious dialogue and as an instrument of foreign policy. Hans Kűng seems to think that the language of human rights requires an infusion of moral energy from an external global ethic in order to achieve its objectives. I think this is a mistake. My view is that the language of human rights presupposes its own global ethic, which may need to be supplemented but by no means supplanted by another global ethic of the sort that Hans Kűng is developing. The opening words of the UDHR are, whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. I would refer to these rights as individual moral entitlements that are intended to be legally enforced. While states do have the special obligation to provide enforcement, possessing as they do a monopoly of legitimate force, I would not use the term state-centric to describe these rights, since that term seems to me to obscure the aspect of individual moral entitlement that is fundamental to these rights. As Han Kűng says, not all obligations have correlative rights, for example, third-party obligations, but human rights most certainly do have correlative obligations, and the correlative rights and obligations in the Human Rights Code are of great moral importance. While it is always useful to encourage ethical commitment to good causes, as Hans Kűng is attempting to do in developing his global ethic, and while human rights can no doubt use a great deal of supplemental ethical help in getting its job done, the global ethic presupposed by human rights language clearly involves, in my view, its own brand of moral commitment on the part of, quote, all members of the human family. The key feature of the global ethic underlying human rights language, at least in the ICCPR, is what I would call moral revulsion to arbitrary force of the sort associated with the regime of Adolf Hitler. Arbitrary force I'm using to mean force imposed for no good reason. Much more needs to be said about my definition of arbitrary force, but I don't have time to go into that now. Consider the non-derogable or unabridgeable rights mentioned in Article 4 of the ICCPR. They are prohibitions against the arbitrary, to use the language of the code, or extrajudicial taking of life, against torture or cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment, against enslavement, against several violations of due process, and, very importantly for me here, violations of freedom of conscience, religion, or belief. All of these are, in my view, examples of the application of arbitrary force. It is this last protection, the one about freedom of religion or belief, that I want to focus on in my remaining remarks. The assumption is that it is the height of the misuse of force to try, as Hitler did, to try to compel and punish belief. Thus, one of the central bulwarks against arbitrary force is to safeguard the set of 5 belief rights that are enumerated in human rights language. Those are free exercise, non-discrimination based on religion or belief, protection of minority religion, prohibition of hate speech, and the protection of parental supervision of religious training. According to the general ethic, global ethic presupposed by human rights language, promoting and protecting these 5 belief rights is taken to be one, though certainly not the only one indispensable means for advancing freedom, justice, and peace in the world. This is an example of the way human rights language can help to fill out and supplement the global ethic being developed by Kűng, 2 of whose objectives are to create a culture of tolerance and a culture of nonviolence, or peace, as I would understand it. Now, this is where interreligious dialogue and foreign policy come in. Much of the work that has been done on the connection between tolerance, understood to include compliance with the belief rights, particularly the first 3, free exercise, non-discrimination, and protection of minority religion, the connection between those belief rights and the creation of peace. My own work over the past 20 years, first at the U.S. Institute of Peace and then at Harvard University, focused on places like Bosnia, Sudan, Sri Lanka, and Iraq. Also, there's a good deal of other work, social scientific work, done on the connection between these belief rights and the decline or rise of violent conflict. Ted Gurr's work, I can only mention it in passing, is extremely interesting because Gurr shows certainly over the late 90s and early 2000s, a decline in violent conflict of a civil war sort. And he traces the reasons for this to the spread of, he uses the term contagion of, the norms of tolerance, which would include the kind of belief rights that I'm suggesting. And the work of his student, Jonathan Fox, would tend to support this conclusion. The upshot is that considering the relation of religion to violent conflict, as was done yesterday, religion often plays an important, though by no means exclusive, role. Conflicts like Bosnia, Sudan, Sri Lanka, and Iraq are obviously about political power, economic interest, territorial interest, all of those. But it's also the case, in my own view, and I've looked into all of these cases fairly carefully, they are also, in one very important sense, about religion. That important sense is evidenced by the degree of attention given to the terms of settlement to questions of belief rights, whether non-discrimination, whether expression of religious belief, whether protection of minority religion. As Aziz Sashadina pointed out in his eloquent comments, I thought, yesterday on the situation in Iraq, the design of the Constitution involved both interreligious dialogue, in which he himself was engaging, and an attempt to apply the results of that conversation to the design of the Iraqi Constitution, whose terms very much included, thanks in part to Aziz's own participation, to allowing for or accommodating religious diversities in keeping with the belief rights that I'm trying to suggest. The same conclusions, had we time, could be stated in behalf of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement in Sudan, the Dayton Agreements in Bosnia, and a variety of constitutional revisions that have taken place in Sri Lanka over the years in respect to trying to make peace in that country. My major and concluding point here is that the consideration of belief rights is frequently only one, but one very important feature of creating a culture of tolerance and a culture of nonviolence or peace. Without being able to go into it, I suggest that the belief rights constitute a kind of index or a set of reference points for interreligious dialogue of the sort that went on in the Iraq case, but also have gone on, in my experience, in Bosnia, in Sudan, in Sri Lanka, designed around seeing how close one can get to the indicators of the belief rights, free exercise, non-discrimination, and protection of minorities. So it becomes, so to speak, an agenda for interreligious discussion, which is aimed at the second problem, namely making peace in those countries. And that finally brings me to the point of foreign policy. If foreign policy, or one of its aspects, is to design policies by the United States or other countries that are attempting to create peace and justice in the world, then it seems to me rather practically foreign policy makers need to take into account the rather rich developing experience that has to do with attempting to approximate in various settings the belief rights about which I'm talking. I think that calls for a good deal of comparative analysis. Aziz and I were just talking about what we learn in Bosnia, what we learn in Sudan, Sri Lanka, and comparing those and then assessing the results in reference to designing future policies for our overcoming conflicts in these conflicted areas. In short, it seems to me the human rights paradigm, supplemented, to be sure, by additional global ethical considerations that the human rights language does not cover. I'm not trying to suggest this is the global ethic, but it is an important global ethic with very important concrete implications, both for interreligious dialogue and for the making of foreign policy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, David. John?
Thank you. Well, David, I'll pick right up there because you went back over some of these past experiences. One of the delights of this conference, and it didn't come to mind until this week as the final details were falling into place, this is kind of a reunion of several of us who worked at the Catholic Bishops' Conference, several in international relations there ready to fall on me as they did in the past. Who were addressing situations around the world, and here I was at the Bishops' Conference there to promote interreligious dialogue. And why was that? Well, John O'Malley talks about the long 19th century, something like 1793 to 1959, from the French Revolution until John the 23rd called the Council. The Catholic Church was stuck in the 19th century. And for some reason, at some particular point, Paul VI, speaking out of a kind of a French personalist tradition, introduced dialogue into the language of the council. with his encyclical on the church. And in fact, the Latinists were very reluctant, and they used the word conversation because they didn't want to use dialogos. They used colloquium. But eventually, then all the other units working on the council started talking about dialogue. And certainly ecumenical dialogue, but interreligious dialogue. And I always begin by saying, when we talk about interreligious dialogue, there are two hands here. And this often leads to conflict and misunderstanding. Now, one hand is to understand how it was formulated in the context of the document Nostra Aetate, the relation of the church to other religions, read in the context of ecumenical dialogue, communio, fellowship, communion, degrees of communion among all believers, as there are greater degrees of communion through baptism among Christians, to the understanding of the church as a communion in the document on the church. Or you could look at dialogue in terms of the other document of the Secretariat that produced these, religious liberty, and in public engagement, dialogue in the public square, the church's engagement with the world, and then Gaudium et Spes, the church in the modern world. Well, public dialogue and interreligious dialogue for spiritual companionship and mutual responsibility in being people of faith, and on the other hand, interreligious dialogue for engagement in public issues are often two different exercises. And we were often doing this when we looked at situations during those years in the 90s of the Balkans, the Middle East, and Sudan. Those are three that came to mind there. With the Balkans, we first of all needed the religious factor to understand the long history of what was unfolding and how Yugoslavia and the communist era had kept the lid on so much disagreement and hostility and diversity. The history there needed to unfold. The larger context was the breakup of the Soviet Union. And that was causing ecumenical dialogues, which had been progressing between Orthodoxy and Latin Catholicism at a certain pace, caused those to be set back and to be reformulated as Eastern Catholics came out of the underground and wanted their roles back in society. And so we were going through a whole shift of trying to understand the role of religion in terms of statecraft here. And really, I think one of the breakthroughs was when we were able to encourage, and on their own through all kinds of international help, local leaders, especially in Bosnia, to begin forming committees, interreligious committees, and working together. There we began, and it was rocky at first, but you had very strong support on the Catholic side coming from John Paul II, who made interreligious dialogue part of his agenda. Maybe in his own sort of centralizing way and papal way, he took too much leadership in interreligious dialogue, but no one seemed to mind when he would call religious leaders together from the Balkans in the snows of January 1993 at Assisi. It's that third Assisi that people don't talk about, the one that involved the representatives of the Balkans praying in Assisi for peace. So that he was an actor. I think the Archbishop of Canterbury, who went to the first Assisi in '86, said perhaps the papacy is the only religious office in the world that could cause such an event to take place and bring people together in one place as he has done, possibly. So we had these, and we talked about Sudan. We needed to know the religious factors there in Sudan. I think you were at the conference for one of those Sudan meetings that Drew had, and trying to understand how Muslims looked at the reforms going on under Tarabi and whether Tarabi was in favor or not in favor, and the Sufi brotherhoods that nobody seemed to talk about. The media, of course, it was always a problem in trying to move ahead with media manipulation of the religious issue, that things were more simply put, well, if you talk to these Muslim representatives from Sudan, then therefore you were on the other side and you were against the rights of Christians in the south of Sudan. And so it's always a difficult way of proceeding and finding a strategy to where you could look at all sides of the issues, but also promote promote the human rights and promote peace as best we could. I remember with the Middle East in particular, the first Iraq War, and people outside of Washington don't understand this, but religious groups here in Washington very seldom get a window to influence government, very seldom. And it just so happened that at a particular point in the buildup, in what we called the crisis in the Gulf, which would have been the fall of 1990, the bishops met as an administrative body and issued a statement. It would be considered an unjustifiable step towards war to double the American troops in Saudi Arabia. And that night, Bush announced a doubling of troops in Saudi Arabia. The timing could not have been better. Suddenly on Nightline, a bishop was appearing, arguing just war criteria. And if you remember those days, the whole of society was talking just war criteria. It was hard to believe, anyone who went through a kind of Thomistic education, that these categories would be in the public square, but they were. And then Bush said, well, we've all discussed it, and now we know it's a just war. So government immediately manipulated it. So, you know, the influence of religion on government actors is precarious and easily manipulated. And I think that's one of the lessons that we learned. Too often, looking at all of these events that we dealt with over the years, too often interreligious dialogue was envisioned as a strategy for results, and more often than not, it was a way of learning. It was the way that the people involved actually learned. And the benefit of dialogue was in the doing of it rather than what it produced. Very often these final statements had little significance, but the bonding that took place among those engaged in it, then you get into this other hand. People are actually bonding. Yes, people are bonding. In fact, when they start talking about why they are engaged in this, coming from the perspective they begin to talk about some of those deep abiding values that often aren't talked about in public language. But the bonding was often the result. The flexibility, no single model seemed to work for every situation. You always had to be flexible. And in fact, nowadays, I think we've gone through such a change in this. No longer are major national or international dialogues really carrying the energy of interreligious dialogue. At one time they did, because they had the support and they were the ones who felt most equipped to engage in these sorts of dialogues. But I think it's happening now away from national offices, away from church offices. It's happening in all other kinds of institutions. Partially, I think, because there's less and less skill for it in national offices when it comes to churches. We have to think in terms of formation and education. Formation for dialogue we talk about in church circles, religious circles. Education we talked about in the public realm. Youth are being educated in a pluralistic world, in a globalized society, and it's in that context that formation for dialogue can take place. And I think that's really our future. In many ways, it's possible that the global ethic was formulated in another era. It was formulated in an era of the 90s as we were facing these confrontations and using the kind of criteria and the actors we had available to us. I think in a post-9/11 world, we need, and in this globalized society, we need to look again at the mechanics of the global ethic. And if we're going to build a social consensus, which is what is talked about, this is going to happen through formation and people engaged in dialogue. It used to be people enter dialogue coming from a religious tradition to engage in dialogue. Now, people are coming to religion through engagement in dialogue. That's a fact. And I think that's going to determine how we look at the global ethic and what the principles of the global ethic are as they're articulated in the future. Thank you.
Thanks very much, John. I'll now say a few words as the token political scientist on the panel. So I want to focus a little bit complimenting and being complementary to what we've just heard on state interests and foreign policy a bit more narrowly, and since we're in Washington, D.C., on the United States in particular as an example of interreligious dialogue as an instrument, if you will, a mechanism of foreign policy. And of course, broadly defined, interreligious dialogue has always been part of interstate relations. You think of the European powers and their relationship with the Ottoman Empire, with China, with India. There's always been a cultural and religious component to those interactions, so we shouldn't forget that. At the same time, it's true that around the time that the Declaration toward a Global Ethic was first promulgated in the early 90s, shifts were taking place in world affairs that have since made religion much more visible as a marker of identity, domestically and internationally. I think a trend that was reinforced and has been reinforced in the wake of the attacks of September 11th, 2001. And now we can speak of interreligious dialogue, at least as potentially a much more fruitful and potentially helpful instrument of foreign policy. And I think we have one example, a recent example of the United States trying to move in this direction, and I'm referring here to President Obama's speech in Cairo in June 2009, which was conceived and promoted as part of a wider opening to the Muslim world, was conceived, not necessarily promoted, but was conceived also as a way to undo some of the damage in Arab and Muslim publics around the world in their views of the United States in the wake of the war on terror, which many perceived to be a war on Islam, in the wake of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. So the U.S. president goes to Cairo and gives a remarkable speech, which I think bears rereading because he's taken up a lot of the imperatives that we've been articulating at this conference. And it's been 2.5 years, so we can look back a bit and reflect on what has happened, what has been learned. I'll just read one quote from that speech, bring it back to your attention. "I've come here to Cairo to seek a new beginning between the United States and Muslims around the world, one based on mutual interest and mutual respect, and one based upon the truth that America and Islam are not exclusive and need not be in competition. Instead, they overlap and share common principles, principles of justice and progress, tolerance, and the dignity of all human beings." So elements of the global ethic we've been discussing. It's interesting to juxtapose America and Islam. The subtext here is, I think, the Christian world and Islam, and interestingly, Obama referred to that somewhat obliquely in this speech and in a speech in Indonesia later that year by referring to his own personal biography as, quote, "a Christian, but my father came from a Kenyan family that includes generations of Muslims." I won't go into the details of the policies of our own government here in the United States designed to flank and promote this opening economic, educational, scientific. I don't think that's important. What we, for the purposes of this discussion, what we can do is reflect back and ask, well, what's really come of this after 2.5 years? And I think not all that much, perhaps, besides the initial opening and the precedent that it set. If you look at the website for this initiative on the government, the White House website, the timeline, which is very rich, just stops in March 2011, around the time of the Arab Spring broke out. And that's certainly part of the reason why this idea of an outreach to the Muslim world, I think, has lost some traction. There's also the problem of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the lack of progress in that direction. There's also President Obama being caught up in a lot of domestic political trouble. But I want to suggest that there's something else, and I don't have time to go into detail, but I wanted to suggest that there may be deeper reasons why interreligious dialogue as an instrument of U.S. foreign policy has its limitations in this case and in others. And that's perhaps by citing the most successful example of such a policy, which we've already touched on, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, drafted at a time after World War II when the United States had an atomic monopoly, when it controlled more than half the world's economic production, And in this context, the UN context, it convened an interreligious, intercultural dialogue about human rights that gave rise to the document that David cited and that we've referred to many times over the last couple of days, a document that echoes, as we know, many of the phrases of the founding documents of the United States: inalienable rights, equality, freedom, and so on. Here's an example of using power to promote interreligious dialogue, which actually helped to kickstart this regime of international law that we've been discussing, this international human rights regime that we've been discussing over the last couple of days. The subsequent history, though, of that original initiative, I think, points to the deeper problem that I want to get at. As we know, for domestic political reasons, the United States and its leaders have been unable to follow through on that initial commitment to international human rights law. The United States has not ratified critical conventions on women, children, cultural and economic rights. And I think as a result, we've lost an opportunity to be at the forefront of the effort to build this human rights regime or build out a global ethic. And interestingly, I think a fundamental reason for that is national identity, political culture, and what some have referred to as civil religion in this country. And the conviction that in some sense, and this was raised yesterday in the conversation about education policy, the notion that the United States is exceptional, the notion that we have nothing to learn from other countries is still very powerfully rooted in our society. It's a staple of political rhetoric. The notion that the United States is the greatest country in the world is axiomatic for just about all Americans. And I think it's very difficult to have this civil religion, this sense that America's role in the world is providential, that there's a kind of an alignment between God's will and U.S. foreign policy on the one hand, and then to promote interreligious dialogue as an instrument of U.S. foreign policy on the other. I will note that Obama seems to be aware of the problem. He backtracked a bit on American exceptionalism. Some of you may remember in 2009, when an interviewer pounced on him on the question, he said, I think the U.S. is exceptional, but I also think Greece is exceptional. You can't do that. That was a mistake, and he's been backtracking ever since. This political mistake, right? Just a quote from his last State of the Nation address earlier this year, which of course is part of his re-election campaign. There he refers to Americans sharing common hopes and a common creed is part of, quote, what sets us apart as a nation. And the same speech referred to, this is Obama, American leadership that has made America not just a place on the map, but a light to the world. I mean, these are the old tropes, city on a hill, light to the world. And Obama is very much in that tradition. And I would argue, just as a way of sparking some conversation, that as long as our political elite and the broader population is so persuaded of America's divine election, if you will, and moral superiority, our efforts to promote interreligious dialogue will not be seen as fully credible in the eyes of the rest of the world. And you can even see in his Cairo speech some interesting references to the United States and our domestic system as pointing the way forward for Egypt and for the Muslim world in general. That's a long way of saying that I think it does come down to politics as well as policy and tremendous constraints that any chief executive in this country faces, and we see it now in this election campaign. So ironically, I think the United States is a model in many ways of religious pluralism domestically, of interreligious dialogue domestically across sectors and across issues. But because there's a kind of a frame of American exceptionalism, a civil religion that puts America over and above other nations, it will, as long as that frame persists, continue to undercut our efforts to develop interreligious dialogue as an instrument of foreign policy. Thank you.
Well, I think what Tom's just said about American foreign policy is a good presupposition for that, what I have to say about global ethic and the new paradigm of international relations and Islam. but I think David Little certainly expects a short answer to his attack.
Civil attack.
Civil attack, it's a very civilized attack. I think we do not disagree on the fact that human rights, of course, include an ethic. That is, I think, quite clear, and I agree with everything you said about that. Second, we agree also that we do not want to impose, so to speak, a global ethic as on civil rights speech or language, you say. You have anyway your language, and I leave it to you, no problem with that. I only would have another opinion, probably, that we cannot reduce the global ethic to human rights. That is a problem. And I would like to quote, I think it's Article 29, which is most silenced by all defenders of human rights in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The last paragraph, article of the Human Rights Declaration speaks about what? Well, basically about global ethic. It's a principle of morality. It's mentioned that the human rights have to be interpreted and realized according to morality. Maybe you read the text, if you have it.
I do. 29 of the UDHR?
Yes.
Yes. Everyone has duties to the community in which alone the free and full development of his personality is possible. In the exercise of his rights and freedoms, everyone shall be subject only to such limitations, and it goes on. And then the requirements of morality, that's what you have in mind, public order and the general welfare of a democratic society.
Well, that is what I want to say. But they generally do not speak about that. The requirements of morality is precisely global ethic. And I think, if my information is correct, it was the influence of Mahatma Gandhi, who was asked about the declaration as it was prepared. And he said, that's not enough to speak about rights. We have at the beginning, the text speaks about the requirements of the community and so on, and then morality. And he made a famous sentence, which I think has to be recorded. The river the Ganges of rights originates in the Himalaya of the duties, of the obligations. I think that's a very good expression of what I want to say. I think if we have no duties at all, if you are allowed to lie, then you have the same problems you had, for instance, with the Earth Charter. I had a nice discussion in the following Parliament of the World's Religions in Cape Town with Stephen Rockefeller. And we agreed that they had to introduce in the Earth Charter a paragraph on truthfulness. Why? Because every statesman and all the people involved in the Rio summit, they all promised, but they had no intention to realize it. So they said, you are not allowed to make wrong promises. So I think you have to presuppose truthfulness in everything. You have to presuppose truthfulness in foreign relations and in, of course, in economics. And truthfulness is not the thing you can prescribe by rights. If I lie to you, I do it. It's, of course, nevertheless, it's an act against my own transparency, my personal dignity, but you cannot hinder me. And there is no paragraph in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights against lying. It's practically, you cannot fight against lying on moral grounds, practically, because that's the inner circle. You are lying in your heart, and if it is not discovered, it's nothing to do. You can nothing do against it. So I think the morality has to be taken very seriously. And I was happy that Tom quoted Obama's speech. As a matter of fact, we had, just by coincidence, an assembly of the Interaction Council in Jeddah, in Saudi Arabia. And we heard about that he would give this speech. And we had, fortunately, a very good American, I do not mention here, who had a direct connection with the White House. And I asked Chancellor Schmidt to his help. And we sent a cable or a thing to the White House, the central person there. And this person said, well, that's very welcome, that's very welcome. And what you should also quote the next time, David, is really the conclusion of the great speech of Obama in Cairo. What is the conclusion? It's the golden rule. The golden rule. Don't do to others what you do that I've done to yourself. And the golden rule is, of course, much more than you can ever have as a right. I think, but the golden rule is a universal rule. The first formulation of the golden rule is made in China 500 years before Christ by Confucius. Don't do to others what you don't have done to yourself. And this is, of course, a rule which is universal in time and in space, and it's very, very important. I think if the Palestinian issue ever will be resolved, it can only be if also the Israelis realize you should not do to others what you would not like have done to yourself. That's a very general ethical rule. So I think we should not fight between the defenders of human rights. I am myself a very strong defender of human rights also because I was touched myself by this. You know, in my fight with the Vatican, we had I have all reasons to be for human rights. But I really think global ethics is supporting vehemently human rights, vehemently. And it's quoted already at the beginning of the Declaration of Chicago. It's quoted the Human Rights Declaration. And I think we would like to have the support of the human rights people and not unhappy and well, not necessary conflicts. Yeah.
Sure.
Well, let me just add a few things about Islam, because I think if what Tom said about American exceptionalism, if the attitude, the positive attitude which is behind your criticism, if this would be widespread in American foreign policy, certainly the United States and also Europe would have less problems with Islam. I always compared the situation of Islam with the situation of the Roman Catholic Church. I think John Borelli was quite right about what he said about the efforts we had made in the Second Vatican Council. I spoke yesterday evening about how difficult it was to get finally the votes for a declaration on religious freedom, because the Catholic Church was opposed all the time, vehemently. Even in my own student years at the Gregorian, I heard still the theory of the Catholic state. And Pius XII made the first small opening in telling the people, well, we have to be tolerant. Why? Not because tolerance is a virtue, not because it is a principle of as a matter of fact, of global ethics, but because if we suppress religious freedom in Spain, what they have done, forbidding, for instance, seminaries or the propagation of the Bible, if we do that, we shall have problems in Scandinavia, and the Protestants will then make the same things to Catholics. That was a purely pragmatic thing, but it was already considered as an opening because Cardinal Ottaviani, the prefect and predecessor of Ratzinger in the Holy Office, explicitly said that's a Catholic doctrine. We have a Catholic state, and tolerance can only be granted in limits, and basically we have not to accept others. We have one true church. So you see, I think this basic attitude has to be behind our discussion now with Muslims. Now, with regard to Muslim, there are, of course, two problems. The whole problem is whether it will be possible now, and we are in a decisive phase of human history, whether this great religion can also have the same turnaround we have in the Catholic Church. And I'm sure that Islam is capable to have really a new, a democratic Islam. What is often forgotten in the present discussion about the Arab Spring is the situation in Turkey. In my book on Islam, I have a whole section about the development of Turkey with the revolution of Atatürk, which was very important, also for human rights, etc. But that it was not sufficient. And if Erdogan finally won the election, it was because he had a more comprehensive view. And Erdogan showed, basically, with all the limitations, with the Kurds and so on, that a democratic Islam is possible. And the whole discussion today in Tunisia, where the whole Arab Spring started, is again whether they want to have also a system which gives a certain rights to Muslim religion and which does not reduce Muslim religion just to a private affair, but nevertheless gives completely religious freedom. And until now, I think they are on the right track. Now, I think, just to formulate it, and I read now what I had in my paper anyway, just to be short. In politics, many Muslims from Morocco to Iran, from Afghanistan to Indonesia, hope more or less openly that Islam and modern democracy come together and that Islam, which theoretically is obliged to Muslim brotherliness, does not continue to remain authoritarian in political practice. There should be no kind of theocratic clerical state in which self-nominated representatives of God on earth take it upon themselves to come forward as rulers, legislators and judges, allegedly to God alone and not to people, and so and no Holy Scripture which replaces or fully determines the national constitution. The Quran cannot replace the constitution. But there is hope that a democratic system will be established in Muslim countries with a separation of powers, a government independent of the clergy and independent parties, freedom of faith and conscience, the right to resist, and the legal opposition. For women, there is a need for the right to personal responsibility and involvement in all spheres of public life, in all stages of education, and in all political decisions. In other words, the same human rights as for men. This would be a state in which non-Muslims do not just occupy the position of a tolerated minority, exemplary though this may have been in the Middle Ages, not a tolerated minority, but have full civil rights. The Arab Spring in Tunisia, Egypt and Libya, and possibly soon also in Syria and in Yemen, could be a huge step forward to make these political hopes a reality. And finally, second, in religion, and that is often not seen in the religious dialogue because that's, of course, a very hot point and very difficult to handle because Muslims are here in specific problems which are different from the problems of Christians in this dialogue. In religion, many educated Muslims, open ulama, and interested laity similarly hope, it's not yet achieved, they hope that their efforts for an interpretation of the Holy Quran and Hadith in accordance with today's insights and demands will finally become a majority view. There are a lot of Muslim intellectuals who are proposing it, but it's not yet a common view at all. They hope that Muslims of the 21st century need not to maintain the uncreatedness and therefore the perfection, infallibility, and immutability of the Quran, of the 78,000 words of the Quran, and indirectly the words also of the Sunnah of the Prophet and the Sharia. They hope that this has not to be maintained. Muslims may take seriously the historical character of the divine revelation. God's word is heard through the words of the Prophet. God's word is attested by the human word, but not precisely identical with the human word. So in practice, there should be no fixed literal interpretation and no pattern of argumentation tied to tradition, but an interpretation in accordance with the spirit and meaning of the whole prophetic book. There should be no legalistically overgrown religious heritage, but a religious heritage perched in accordance with the criteria of original Islam and reinterpreted for our time. Islam as a foundation should not be understood fundamentalistically, but in keeping with our time. To keep the tradition is another thing than traditionalism. But you see, these are, I think, the very serious problem. We have to enter also into interreligious dialogue, because in politics many things are blocked by fundamentalist interpretation of the Quran or of the Sharia, and also a lot of things are blocked in the Jewish-Christian and Jewish-Muslim dialogue by a legalistic interpretation of the Old Testament, of the Hebrew Bible, which does not give clear indications where the limits of the State of Israel are. There are different interpretations of that. So you see, in all that, we need, I think, that also politicians and diplomats know something about these problems.
Thank you very much. And we now have more than a half hour to join a larger discussion. You've heard several different approaches to the topic. I came at it more from a foreign policy and U.S. perspective, and David and Professor Küng had an interesting exchange about the global ethic versus human rights, which is a theme that we've already addressed during the meeting, and then John brought in some of the more religious dimensions of interreligious dialogue in international policy context. So let's try to follow those strands in the question period, but also any other issues you'd like to raise. Jose? And please stand up and introduce yourself, and we've got a microphone here.
Jose Casanova from the Berkley Center. I'm sorry I could not be part of the conversation these last 2 days. I was out of town, but I'm very pleased to have listened to the four of you. It was striking to listen, and because you represent the tensions precisely between all the issues. We have two Catholic ecumenists here, very, very different models of Catholic ecumenism. Obviously, Hans Küng has been the pioneer, first with Protestants, then with the Jewish dialogue, then with Abrahamic, then with all world religions. But of course has difficulty understanding Assisi and presenting Assisi as a model of religious conservative leaders coming together. The fact we need both. We need intellectuals and liberal elites from all the world religions coming together and having dialogue, and we need conservative religious leaders, and we need actually people on the ground, neighbors, religious neighbors, recognizing each other, coming to terms. So this tension, I think that it is simply that it is a very complex issue. And both of you on human rights, it was very striking, you, David, presenting the international human rights regime, which of course emerged out of an American project. And yet America itself being uneasy about it, and of course other people's being uneasy because they see too much as an American project. The fact is that even when we agree on universal human rights, still we are going to disagree on the specific content and the specific implementation and the cultural hermeneutic understanding of them. The same thing is with the golden rule. We can agree on the principles, but implementation at the everyday life, we are going to have disagreements based on cultural understandings. So I think that there is room for all the positions on the table. I think that is not, I think they are complementary.
Thank you. Professor Sachedina?
I think that we have potentially identified the issue of interfaith relations and its centrality in the formation of what we call the possibility of policies that would help the state to talk to one another. What I find to be quite disturbing sometimes is that we feel that the public is participating in the scholarly opinion in the Muslim world. What I find to be true is that the public is not with the scholarship. However educated, even modernly educated men and women are really in disagreement with their scholars. So whom we listen to in this part of the world have no voice in their part of the world. Imagine Abdullah Naim is not allowed to speak in Sudan. He's not allowed to speak in any part of the Muslim world. In Nigeria, there was a riot when he came to speak. What I'm talking about is that we as intellectual Muslims, reformist Muslims, are very much distant from the people whom we represent. So we are engaging in some kind of representational discourse, which is not actually the feeling of the people. The people still believe, a Muslim believes he's the only one who's going to go into paradise. You know, there is this self-righteous attitude that is prevalent even among educated people. You can find people discussing in the university. So I'm teaching in Iran, and I know the student body talking to me said, oh, Shia is the only one that's going to be saved. You know, it's not even the Sunni doesn't stand a chance. So we are really talking of a situation on the field. How do we, what I call there is a shortcoming in the public outreach. We are still talking to the converted at our level. And we feel to be satisfied because we talk to the people who can talk to us in Germany, in France, United States, anywhere. We are talking to the people who can deliver to us what we want to hear. But when we go to the field, there's a very different attitude and approach. That's where I think what I found David doing and my kind of work is that we want to work from the grassroots and go up rather than coming from the top down. The only way we can have an influence in the interfaith relations is really to change the minds of the people on the street. Because my wife goes to the religious school in Iran, and she hears all the time, you know, Jews and Christians cannot be saved. These are women who are learned, who are, you know, educated women. They have BA degree, PhD degrees, and they say Sunnis cannot be saved. You know, now if this is the opinion of the generality, where do we stand at the level of the government and influence them to really make a difference in the way we handle our foreign policy? Are we getting caught up in a diagloss? Because this is part of the culture. Muslim culture, I must tell you that it talks to you on a different language when you come from outside, and there's another language that is spoken inside. We have in Persian a saying, biruni daruni. You speak to your special ones inside, a different thing. When you present outside, you speak differently. And I think it's very difficult to penetrate if you don't know the culture. And that's what we are faced with in interfaith relations.
Thanks, that's fascinating. All right, I've identified several hands. We'll start over here with Stefan and then a student in the back.
I'm very grateful for your remarks because you, so to say, you speak out of my heart, you know. We are well aware of the problems you mentioned in our foundation, you know. And I'm very grateful that your remarks, John Borelli, ended with the problems of interreligious dialogue on the grassroots level. Yeah? And I'm also very happy that our discussions yesterday about global law and global ethic ended with the question of education, of ethical education, from down to bottom. Yeah? And that's the reason why our foundation is doing a work on different levels. We are discussing here on an academic level. We are well aware of this, but we are also doing the same work on a very, very elementary level, and that's the presupposition to be successful with these ideas. If you want to create a culture of tolerance and respect, we can do it on an international political level, and we can ask for ways how to manage it. But the basis of this is, for a new culture of living together, is that we have to start with the children to learn to live together. There's a saying of a famous German philosopher, of a dialogue he had, and at the end he spoke, oh, well, we have to learn to live together in any way, yeah? And that's the way we are doing. And so the presupposition of respect is something, is knowledge, is the readiness to live together, the readiness to solve conflict without violence, the readiness to accept other ways of life, etc. And the presupposition for that is knowledge of each other, and that's the reason why our foundation is doing such a lot of work in schools, with elementary, with children. We are training teachers, etc., etc. And because you have the one basic presupposition is knowledge, intercultural knowledge, and knowledge of ethics. And it's for children very helpful to know there are so lot differences in worldviews, in views of salvation, for example, in the different religions, in dogmas. But when they learn, okay, we have the same duties. The Quran is saying something about respect, each other, etc., justice, etc., and that's very helpful for children. And so the global ethic idea is not an idea which comes from above, because it's an idea which is growing from the grassroots. And that's a very important task of our work. And so you have to see both aspects together. And that's also the reason why rights and responsibilities have this relation together. They are complementary, and that's the reason, and children can learn it. And so I think what you have said about Islamic world, we have tested 2 years ago in Indonesia. We have been there, and we have had dialogues on different levels with academics, with journalists, with liberal, with conservative Muslims, with Quran schools. And it's possible, you know. But we know they speak different languages, and so it's very important to articulate the idea of a good living together in sense of a global ethic on different levels. Thank you.
So let's collect a couple more contributions. Back in the corner, Colin, and then Dagmar, and then Peter, Jerry, and then John. Yeah.
Okay, so I've sort of a three-headed monster of a question.
Introduce yourself.
Okay. I'm Colin Steele. I'm one of Professor Banchoff's undergrads. And I have a question that, of the sort that he's used to by now, because I'm in his class. And I ask this kind of thing all the time. So the first part of the question is the document that was released by the Papal Council on Justice and Peace the other day which was mentioned earlier, mentioned the principles of subsidiarity and also an international governance scheme as hopes for the future of the world. They think that in order to achieve ethical interactions in governance and human rights and economics, we need to have some kind of global governance, and we also need to have subsidiarity in terms of dealing with problems at the most basic level that we can. And it sounds like the previous 2 or 3 comments have spoken to that same kind of idea. Let's let different religions, different groups of people work on their own things in their own ways, and yet at the top level we have things like Stiftung Global Ethos that are trying to create some kind of basic golden rule for the world. So if you could elaborate a little bit on how you see that relation playing out, if that makes sense. And the second half of the question is, do you think that we could achieve in international relations something akin to the religious marketplace idea, that instead of simply declaring ourselves the world's greatest country, we could have countries essentially compete on foreign policy and let other countries look? In other words, to lead by example rather than leading from behind or simply saying we're the light on the hill.
Okay, well, we've had several contributions and questions interwoven with those contributions. Let's have a few minutes for responses from the panel, then we'll collect a bunch more and a final set of responses from the panel. David, did you want to you hold off? You want to?
Yeah, I don't have a lot of burning things to say, no.
John?
A couple of things. Identifying what these institutions are of dialogue. I don't mean institutions in what we think of as foundations, but I mean new opportunities. So, for example, 3 years ago, the King of Jordan convened Muslim scholars from all over the world in an ongoing process of trying to get the voice of the middle back into the media, because the voice of extremists were often speaking, and convened scholars and came up with this text called A Common Word. To me, that's a new institution. It couldn't have been without opportunities before it. And what's going on now in the Arab world, in North Africa, the Arab Spring, as we call it, I think may give rise to new kinds of institutions and opportunities, occasions where people are encountering each other and this interreligious dimension of dialogue comes in. That was one thing. Secondly, we should also remember that despite the problem of intellectuals saying one thing and people on the lived experience saying another thing, or it's not being absorbed. We had the same problem. I mean, as Hans was saying, we could see a parallel with the Catholic Church. I mean, so much of my work at the Bishops' Conference was speaking to Catholics saying, it's okay, we can dialogue. This is really what the church is saying now. This is what the teaching is. And, you know, it's going to water down our faith. We can't do that. You know, so the reception itself is parallel for attitudes. And I think the lived experience, though, in the long run, the lived experience of pluralism has a far more effective change, brings far more effective change in a person's life than all of the teachings and of intellectuals, it seems. So.
Thank you. I'll say a bit about a theme that I saw in a couple of the responses, which is the relationship of power to dialogue. For example, we hear over and over again that we need to move down from the elites to the masses, for lack of a better word, to inculcate the global ethic, to inculcate values, the idea of dialogue, and I think that's true. But to get that to happen, you've got to work through institutions from the top down, I would argue, educational institutions, but also the professions, lawyers, doctors, and business people who can be brought into this dialogue by understanding how issues of ethics and values intersect with their life worlds. And these are people who have power in civil society and can be engaged in interesting ways, I think, going forward. That relates to the international power dimension that Colin indirectly alluded to. When can we move toward a marketplace of ideas where there's a competition of soft power, where the United States meets other countries on a more or less level playing field? Well, part of the answer is we have to wait and see, wait for the playing field to become more level as the United States dominance in economic and political and security terms, which really was at its height right after World War II, continues to decline. Other powers rise. I think the United States will be compelled, and its leaders will be compelled, to shift toward a recognition of other world powers as equals, and that'll facilitate the kind of marketplace of ideas and soft power that you mentioned.
Maybe
sure, David.
Just one quick word. About this matter of elites and common life. One of the things that's important about Gur's work and some of the follow-up stuff is that, in fact, some of these norms are getting institutionalized in these various countries. In other words, it's not, if Gur is right, that there has been a decline in ethnic and nationalist violence, and secondly, that one of the reasons is the spread or the contagion of norms of tolerance, which would include some of the things that I've mentioned, then this is not just an elite sort of saying things in the air and the ground not responding. The whole point is that the ground is responding in response to the questions of settling conflict. And this creates the reference point, it seems to me, for on-the-ground considerations. And thus, you do get in these countries, some successful, some not, religious discussions, cross-religion discussions. For example, in Bosnia, they're developed to some degree successful, an interreligious council, which for a while at least was very active in working together across religious boundaries to recreate destroyed sites of worship, Islam, Catholics, and Serbian Orthodox. That seems to me interesting, and thus these are very much on the ground. And I think we need to look, all of us interested in this, at empirical work that's going on in these various settings in order to see what is taking hold and what is not. Obviously, the Sudanese arrangement is not going very well, it seems to me. And one needs to continue to reflect what went wrong, what are the dynamics there. They're attempting to approximate the split between the two sections of the country was an attempt to accommodate different religious and ethnic perspectives. That arrangement is so far not altogether hopeful, but we need to keep looking on the ground to see what's working and what's not.
Okay, let's see all the hands of people who'd like to speak. I had Dagmar,
Peter,
Jerry, John, Marilyn. That's it? Okay, that's 5 of you. If you just keep it relatively brief, we'll have time for a follow-on discussion here on the panel. So.
Thank you. My name is Dagmar Brün. I'm a Hebrew Bible scholar and now the head of the American Jewish-German Exchange Project. That means I deal with interreligious dialogue as foreign policy instrument. What I would like to say, it's only a remark on what Professor Kűng said, because I think what he said is totally wrong. And I'm talking about Holy Scriptures now, because I think if we take interreligious dialogue very serious, we have to talk about Holy Scriptures, at least if we talk about Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And you said, and you talked already yesterday a little bit about the historical critical scholarship, and that you miss that if it comes to Islam, and you said that you would see how Islam is dealing with the Holy Scripture. It's a quite fundamentalistic way. And then you said a few minutes ago that you also see problems in the Jewish interpretation. I think you called it legalistic. And I think if we take interreligious dialogue serious, we have to be very aware that there are different methods to deal with the Holy Scripture, and that the historical critical method, as much as I love it, I'm adored to it, it's only one method, and it's even a little bit outdated maybe in a postmodern area. And I think it's very, very important really to see how we deal in our different ways with Holy Scriptures. Because seeing the one method as a little bit, let's say, more superior to the others doesn't help, and I would say it's even dangerous. I also read your books, and I think it's not what you normally say, and maybe it's the way of a podium to make it very short, but I think it's very important to say that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry.
Jerry Powers, University of Notre Dame. I want to say a word about U.S. foreign policy. There's a tendency in U.S. foreign policy to think that when you do engage religion, it should be to encourage interreligious dialogue of some sort, and preferably interreligious action of some kind. There are a couple of problems with that. One is you have a serious problem of religious illiteracy among the foreign policy makers, and so they simply don't know what they're dealing with when they try to engage religion. Secondly, when they do engage, of course, they're governments, so they tend to instrumentalize religion for their own particular political purposes, which is a real problem for the religious groups who that are involved with the governments. And third, I think this relates to Professor Sachedina's point, that they assume that because religion is part of the problem, the solution is interreligious engagement, interreligious common action, when in fact the solution is usually, oftentimes found in single identity work within religious groups. So that's one reason in the Catholic world, we don't let the interreligious people who are engaged in the dialogue deal with peace and justice issues. The peace and justice offices deal with peace and justice issues, because we don't expect the interreligious dialogue to lead the peace and justice long term. We expect the focus on peace and justice, working interreligiously where appropriate.
See what I was up against, you know?
Well, working with other religious groups all the time, but oftentimes working within your own religious group in your own way, in a way that's going to be able to mobilize people based on the deepest elements of your faith. And a lot of both the governments, but also people in foundations who fund this work, academics who write about it, they don't really, they focus almost exclusively on the interreligious dimension, and they miss the importance of the single identity piece.
Thank you. John?
Excuse me, John Langen, Georgetown University. Two observations. One is that I think, at least as we deal with the Islamic world, we're confronted with the need for a great deal of intra-religious dialogue. That we are often very concerned, and understandably, with the fate, say, of Copts in Egypt, and with the possibility of Muslim intolerance of non-Muslims. But there are very important problems internal to the Muslim community, which have to be worked out within that community. But, and lest we become unduly patronizing, it's worth remembering that developing a level of tolerance within Christianity that we now take for granted is a relatively recent thing. And you don't have to go very far back to find luxuriant expressions of hatred and contempt for the whore of Babylon or for the terrible confusion that marks Protestantism and so on. So, but in a way, in the process of healing that has to go forward, I suspect that the intra-religious development within Islam is more difficult, more important, and more urgent than the interreligious. The other thing that I would suggest is that we're in a situation where we are performing before the world we're doing interreligious dialogue. And that we have a situation where the media reward polarization. And if we look at say, the political dynamics of various conflict situations, especially, say, Israel and Palestine, extremists feed and nourish each other on opposite sides. That encouraging desperate characterizations of the other side fits the agenda, the political agenda of both the extremists in both religious communities in that situation and in a fair number of other situations.
Thank you. You could pass right to Marilyn behind you, John. Yeah.
I wanted to just check with Professor Little your 5 elements of religious belief, from free exercise to parental supervision. That free exercise includes the right to change a religion. Because I was stressing that because of the freedom to believe document of the Baha'is, that they feel the UDHR sort of lets them down by not defending the freedom to change a religion, even though it's sort of in there. Yeah. Thank you very much. And then I was wondering, as a Catholic American, am I guilty then of 2 exceptionalisms? Probably, you know, yeah, at least, right. Thanks.
And a last comment question from Peter over here.
Peter Kirschlager from the Center for Human Rights Education at the University of Teacher Education, Lucerne, Switzerland. Thank you so much for your contributions and the interesting discussion so far. I am a little bit uncomfortable with this elite and mass language. For example, if you look at human rights, they're not just, theoretically developed academic ideas, but normally understood as concrete reactions on concrete experiences of human beings of injustice. So if you look at the Arab Spring, for example, there wasn't really a movement by elite. It was really a grassroots movement which surprisingly surprised a lot of the academia, a lot of the elite, and they tried afterwards to understand what's really is going on or was going on. So I was wondering if this example of human rights really seen as something coming from the ground could be also used as an example for the interreligious dialogue or global ethic, in a sense that first of all, it is based on a grassroots movement, but secondly, and probably more interesting as a paradigm, that this grassroots movement, for example, in the Arab Spring, was actually using concepts and language developed in theory, like dignity and freedom, to express what they really were in favor or against. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's start with John, and we'll just
Sure.
move down the line.
Well, just one comment. We didn't, in the Interreligious shop, want to have the foreign policy advisors dictate the rules of interreligious dialogue. And in fact, we knew that it takes many forms. And in fact, it is good that religious communities, as a result of interventions and so forth, make adjustments for dealing with one another internally. And so we reflected this tension, but I want to again say we were working with two different models with two different understandings of how dialogue works, and they both need to be respected. And it is in a cooperative sense that we are able to make, I think, some significant progress. But again, I think we are in a changing situation, and what was once true of how we conducted our language of dialogue, of appreciation, of cooperation, is changing before our eyes in our contemporary world.
One point about Jerry Power's point about foreign policy people, policymakers, and religion. I think you're right, Jerry, and you and I have wrestled with this with members of the State Department over the years. But I will say that after the passage of IRFA, the International Religious Freedom Act, in 1998, there was certainly a significant change in reporting on the part of the State Department, and secondly, taking account of violations of the belief rights that I've listed. And that's become, it seems to me, clear in the kinds of officers that are being appointed, the degree to which they are now required to look into the practices of religious discrimination, et cetera, on the ground. And it does seem to me that as a result of that, you've had an increase in the U.S. government, at least, of the importance of these considerations. How IRFA itself has worked out in practice, I think, is a somewhat checkered story. Nevertheless, I think there are some benefits in respect, and I believe they've had a certain impact on the Obama administration as well.
Thank you. Professor Kűng, you have the last word.
Well, I think the last word has to be a word of thanks. I think all who have been present from the beginning have made a great deal of experiences. I think we had excellent papers, and I'm most grateful for those who worked for these papers a great deal. And I hope that we will have a way to publish these papers. But I was also very satisfied by the high level of discussion we had. I think it was extraordinarily nice, fair, and to the point. And I hope that we also find a way to have a resume of the discussions. Everything is now typed, and I hope that we can publish also the results of this discussion together with the papers. But all this would not have been possible without our partners here at Georgetown University. I have to give my thanks especially, of course, to Tom Banchoff and his center, Berkeley Center. They were our partners, and we cooperated very well, and everything has been well prepared, and we had, I think, the whole development of the discussions were well prepared by everything of the organization, who worked very smoothly and effectively. And I would like to express my thanks to John Borelli, an old friend of mine, who was already working at the time of the Vatican Council and earlier days with me. And I think he may express our gratitude to the president of Georgetown University, De Gioia, who gave his welcome greetings at the beginning. And I know he has a great affinity to global ethics. I remember this from the last time when I was here at the university. I am happy that I was celebrating my 50th, so to speak, my 50th anniversary of my first lecture here at Georgetown University under his auspices in a very good spirit. So many thanks to the president and his staff. And so I think from our side we shall go back with plenty of good experiences and feel encouraged to go on with our own work. I'd say this also in the name of my colleagues and friends who were with me. thank you very much for everything you have done for us.
Thank you. Okay. And let's have a final round of applause for Brad Shingleton, who's going to come up and say a few words. Yeah.
I am sorry to have, I would have to mention it myself because he was at the origin, I said from the beginning, but he may speak now for himself.
Yeah. Well, I just want to thank you, Dr. Küng, Stefan, and Günther from the Global Ethic Foundation. It was your openness and your willingness to entertain this idea when I put it to you 3 years ago, your commitment to it and your energetic participation. You've given us so much to think about. So I personally want to thank you very much for making this possible.
Thank you. All right. Have a great afternoon. Could I ask you to sign this for me?